Next, we'll look at the behavioural approach to explaining and treating phobias. So within this, we need to look at the two-process model, including classical and operant conditioning, systematic desensitisation, including relaxation and use of hierarchy, and flooding. So make sure you're aware of all of the key terms that are in this advanced information. There's a section on your worksheet to define the key terms. Make sure you know what all of these mean and you've got examples for each part of them. We'll start with the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. So this is quite lengthy. So we'll start with the two-process model. The two-process model. The behavioural approach focuses on the role of learning and the acquisition of behaviour. Behavioural characteristics of phobias are panic, avoidance, and endurance. Phobias are learnt by classical conditioning, then continued because of operant conditioning. So the two-process model is basically the idea that they're learnt by classical conditioning, then they're maintained because of operant conditioning, and we'll have a look at both of those. So classical conditioning. We learn to associate a neutral stimulus, which we have no fear towards, with something that already triggers a fear response, an unconditioned stimulus. An example of this is Watson and Rayner. So they created a phobia in a 9-month-old baby called Little Albert. Albert did not show anxiety at the start of the study when he was shown a white rat. The white rat, neutral stimulus, was then presented to Albert, and the researcher made a loud, frightening noise, which was the unconditioned stimulus, by banging an iron bar close to Albert's ear. This created an unconditioned response of fear. The neutral stimulus, rat, and unconditioned stimulus, loud noise, are encountered together, and in time the neutral stimulus, so the rat, becomes associated with the unconditioned stimulus, and both now produce the fear response. The rat, neutral stimulus, becomes a conditioned stimulus and produces a conditioned response of fear. This fear response was generalised to a similar object such as a fur coat. With regards to the little Albert, I know that in your lesson you've got a formula for classical conditioning, and it would be worth putting the Watson and Rayner study into that formula, because that might make it easier when you are revising. So it's like UCS plus, equals UCR NS plus UCS equals UCR, and then NS becomes CS, and CS produces CR. So that's obviously, I'm saying a lot of letters there, but once you've got that formula in front of you that you've done in your lessons, it's easier for you to input the terms such as rat and loud noise and fear into that formula, and you can use that formula to revise. It's much easier than reading through all of that information. Draw the formula, revise the formula, and make sure you can elaborate on that formula to explain what's happening. So then we've got operant conditioning. So responses acquired by classical conditioning tend to decline over time. Long-lasting phobic responses have been explained as the result of operant conditioning. This is when a behaviour is reinforced or rewarded or punished. Reinforcement tends to increase the frequency of a behaviour. Through negative reinforcement, an individual avoids the situation, and this results in a desirable consequence, so avoiding the feeling of panic. This means that the behaviour will be repeated. Mora suggested that whenever we avoid a phobic stimulus, we actually escape the fear and anxiety that we would have experienced if we had remained there. This therefore reinforces the avoidance behaviour, and so the phobia is maintained. So with regards to the two-process model, you've got this idea that we've got classical conditioning to start with, and this is how we learn a phobia, through that association, and then the operant conditioning where our fear is maintained through avoidance and that negative reinforcement. in evaluation, sorry, just make sure you can see that. So real-world application of the behavioural explanation can be seen in exposure therapy, such as systematic desensitization. In exposure therapy, the avoidance behaviour is prevented and the phobia therefore is no longer reinforced by avoidance. When this avoidance is prevented, the phobia is cured. This shows the value of the two-process approach as it identifies a means of treating phobias. Also, with regards to systematic desensitization, we're using counter-conditioning there, so we're using this idea of classical conditioning to counter-condition an individual's phobic behaviour. So a good thing about this behavioural explanation is we can apply it to the real world and we can use it to treat individuals. A limitation, it does not account for the cognitive aspects of phobias, as behavioural explanations explain the key behaviours of phobias such as avoidance. However, we know that phobias have a cognitive component, for example, irrational beliefs about the phobic stimulus, and the two-process model does not explain this. It's therefore not a complete explanation of the symptoms of phobias. So this is the idea that the two-process model, although it is a good explanation, it's not a complete explanation because it doesn't take into account the cognitions behind phobic behaviours. And finally, we've got one more strength, so there's evidence to show a link between a bad experience and a phobia. So we've got Little Albert there. It explains how a frightening experience involving a stimulus can lead to a phobia. And we've got some additional research. So we've got this study here in 2006, which found that 73% of people with a fear of dental treatment had experienced a traumatic experience involving dentistry, compared to a control group of people with low dental anxiety, where only 21% had experienced a traumatic event. So that's the idea that if you've experienced a traumatic event, you're more likely to develop a fear. And it's that idea of conditioning there. However, this data is correlational, and not all phobias are linked to a bad experience. For example, snake phobia is a common occurrence in populations where very few people have had any experience of snakes. Therefore, the association between phobias and frightening experiences is not as strong as we would expect, and the behavioural explanation is not a complete explanation. So although we started there with the strength and we've discussed the evidence, we've developed that and we've put a however, so we've put some counter evidence there to suggest that it's not actually a complete explanation. So that final bullet point there, it shows you how you can combine a strength with a limitation to give a more holistic evaluation of an approach or an explanation to phobias. So that's our behavioural explanation for phobias, and now we'll have a look at behavioural treatments. So this is split into systematic desensitization and flooding, and we'll start with systematic desensitization. So, systematic desensitization is a behavioural therapy designed to gradually reduce phobic anxiety through classical conditioning. A person learns to relax in the presence of a phobic stimulus, and a new response to the phobic stimulus is learned. So this is counter-conditioning. We start with an anxiety hierarchy, which is put together by a client with a phobia and a therapist. This is a list of situations related to the phobic stimulus that provoke anxiety, arranged in order from least to most frightening. So for example, if someone had arachnophobia, the least anxiety-provoking might be a picture of a spider, and the most anxiety-provoking may be having a spider in your hand. Then we have relaxation. So the therapist teaches the client to relax as deeply as possible. It's impossible to be afraid and relaxed at the same time, as the one emotion prevents the other, which is reciprocal inhibition. The relaxation may involve light breathing exercises, or the client may learn mental imagery techniques, so imagining themselves in relaxing situations like on a beach. They may also learn meditation or use drugs such as Valium to help with relaxation. So there's a number of relaxation techniques that the client has to learn before they take part in the final aspect, which is exposure. The client is exposed to the phobic stimulus while in a relaxed state. This takes place across several sessions, starting at the bottom of the anxiety hierarchy. When the client can stay relaxed in the presence of lower levels of the phobic stimulus, they then move up the hierarchy. Treatment is successful when the client can stay relaxed in situations which are high on the anxiety hierarchy. And then we've got flooding, which differs a little. So let's have a little look at that. And there we go. So, flooding involves exposing people with a phobia to their phobic stimulus. However, there is no gradual build-up in anxiety hierarchy. Instead, flooding involves immediate exposure to a very frightening situation. So for the spider phobia, it might be that you're just put in a room full of spiders and you're left in there for 2 hours. Flooding sessions are longer than systematic desensitization sessions. One session often lasts between 2 and 3 hours. Sometimes only one session is needed to cure a phobia. The flooding stops phobic responses very quickly. This may be because without the option of avoidance, the client quickly learns that the phobic stimulus is harmless, and this is called extinction. A learned response is extinguished when the conditioned response, for example a dog, is encountered without the unconditioned stimulus, being bitten. The result is that the unconditioned stimulus no longer produces the conditioned response of fear. So they learn that it's not harmful. Flooding is not ethical, but it is it's not unethical, but it is an unpleasant experience. It is important that clients give fully informed consent to this traumatic procedure and that they are fully prepared for the flooding session. So it's not technically unethical, but the therapist is aware that it's an unpleasant experience, and they would make you aware of that before you took part, and you would have to give fully informed consent. So you have to be fully aware of what was going to happen to you. So now we've got some evaluation points. We've got 2 for each. So 2 for systematic desensitization and 2 for flooding. So a strength of systematic desensitization is supporting research. Gilroy et al. 2003 followed up 42 people who had systematic desensitization for a spider phobia in 3 45-minute sessions. At both 3 and 33 months, the systematic desensitization group were less fearful than a control group who were treated with relaxation without exposure. Further research suggests that systematic desensitization is effective for specific phobia, social phobia, and agoraphobia. This means that systematic desensitization is likely to be helpful for people with phobias. So it's that real-world application that we've seen multiple times in this topic area. It's really helpful for us to use to treat an individual. You can also use this idea of systematic desensitization being a good and effective treatment to evaluate the behavioural explanation, because to use the behavioural explanation, systematic desensitization, if that works, then it supports this idea that the behavioural explanation is an appropriate and valid explanation for phobic disorders. Another strength of systematic desensitization is that it can be used to help people with learning disabilities. So some people requiring treatment for phobias also have a learning disability, and the alternatives to systematic desensitization are often unsuitable, and they often struggle with cognitive therapies that require complex rational thought, and they also feel confused and distressed by the traumatic experience of flooding. This means that systematic desensitization is an appropriate treatment for people with learning disability. So again, that's another example of real-world application. And then we've got some information about flooding. So we've got 2 evaluation points here for flooding. So flooding is highly cost effective as it can help people overcome their phobia and is not expensive. It can work in as little as 1 session as opposed to 10 sessions for systematic desensitization to achieve the same results. This means that more people can be treated at the same cost with flooding than systematic desensitization. So it's very cost effective. A problem, so flooding, a limitation, is a highly unpleasant experience. Confronting one's phobic stimulus in an extreme form can cause extreme anxiety. Schumacher et al. 2015 found that participants and therapists rated flooding as significantly more stressful than systematic desensitization. This raises the ethical issue for a psychologist because they're knowingly causing the stress of their clients, although it's not a serious issue if they obtain informed consent. But due to the trauma, there are also high dropout rates compared to systematic desensitization, so therapists may therefore avoid using this treatment. So if you know you're going to cause stress to your clients, then that's an issue that you would have to deal with as a therapist. And if you know that there's going to be a high dropout rate, then you might maybe choose to use systematic desensitization instead. So those are the behavioural approach and the behavioural approach to explaining phobias and the behavioural approach to treating phobias. Make sure you're aware of the key terms. If you have a look in the example questions in the worksheet, there's some application questions where you would have to use that formula to explain an individual's phobia using classical conditioning, and there's some evaluation questions in there as well. You could get an extended answer question, so it could be like a 16-mark question where you would have 20 minutes to answer that. And also to be aware that you can use aspects of psychopathology such as the behavioural approach to support the approaches section when you're talking about whichever approaches come up in that advanced information. If one of them happens to be the behavioural approach, you could use this topic to support the behavioural approach in paper 2. So you can use this information across paper 2 as well as paper 1. So have a go at those example questions, define those key terms, and have a look and make sure you can explain the supporting research. And then we'll move on to the final part.